Welcome back to Switch to Linux. Today I want to talk a little bit about Raspberry Pi as a main computer because there is a gentleman at Andrew Cunningham over at Ars Technica who wanted to run a Raspberry Pi 5 as his main computer for 2 weeks and see what the result is. And so I have some thoughts and some commentary on this, and I'm going to tell you why I have thoughts and commentary and what the important parts are. And we're going to dissect some of his approach, correct a few things. So we'll go ahead and dive into here. First and foremost, he says in the article he is not a Linux absolute novice, but certainly not a Linux expert. He's comfortable staying within Debian branches, and he's not super knowledgeable in a lot of the back-end things of Linux. But I always put in a lot of praise towards anybody who takes a valiant effort to do something like this. And I think we should probably start with a few qualifications and expectations before we dive into the article. So first and foremost, qualification, I have been running a Raspberry Pi as my main web development computer for, I think, over 3 years now. So I have some thoughts on this article. When I saw somebody doing an article on, I tried Raspberry Pi for 2 weeks as a main computer, and I have some thoughts. Well, I have some thoughts after 3 years, so we'll do that. Of course, if you are new to this channel, and if you are, please consider hitting that subscribe button and like it, leave us a comment down there, and that always helps the videos in the algorithm. But if you didn't know, I do all of these videos from a van. That's why we have this interesting backdrop. This is the inside of my van. I live on the road full time, and one of the factors you have to consider when you're on the road is you have to be very careful of your power. Now, because I needed really high throughput everything, this video is being recorded on my streaming PC, which is rednecked on into a cabinet over here. And it is a beautiful piece of techno redneck. And I mean, I'm holding this thing down with bungee straps, guys. Come on, man. But you need something like that when you're doing video, because I want good, smooth, flawless video, and we need all of the components going in and all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, the video editing takes some extra things. But when we're talking about doing web design and development, I don't need that much power, because usually you're just manipulating text documents and then pushing them to a server and then seeing how they look in a web browser. None of that requires a ton of extra work. And so because you have to monitor your power, this streaming PC takes approximately 100 to 150 watts of real power used per hour. Raspberry Pi takes less than 1. And so with that, we have to keep in mind that there's reasons to use a lower spec computer on lower spec jobs and reasons to use a higher spec computer on a higher spec job. So the Raspberry Pi that I use in my main build out is a Raspberry Pi 4B with 8 gigs of RAM. What he is working with is the new Raspberry Pi 5, which I would like to possibly get one, but there are a few concerns and reasons I can't get one yet. Although I think it'd be a massive performance boost for what I'm doing. And the power consumption isn't a lot more. It is more, but not a lot more. We're talking about going from about a 15 watt to about a 27 watt. So we're not talking about a lot. Now, I said earlier mine uses less than 1. I think it uses, I actually have those numbers somewhere. I forget what they are. The real world usage isn't the 27 watts. When they say 27 watts, that is the absolute max power the thing is capable of drawing. When you're looking at how electrical circuitry is and how things have to be reported, you have to do something like that, and it's usually a percentage more. So my computer, the main streaming PC, has a 750 watt power supply. I got a lot of stuff plugged into it, but in real world applications, plugging in watt meters, it uses roughly 90 watts on idle and up to 150 to 200 watts when it is doing some high throughput video rendering. Of course, I do not have my computer maxed out with everything in there. I don't have a super power hungry GPU and things like that. But the Raspberry Pi, in my real world calculations, I think it uses about, if I remember correctly, I think it used around 3 to 4 watts when I did measurements. So this new one probably uses, my random guess, if they're saying 27 watt, probably up to 8 watts, which is reasonable. I could run that in the van without a huge hit on my power performance. But there are a few other issues. Primarily, it is that power issue that is the biggest problem, because what it requires is a 27 watt adapter that's USB Type-C. So we're looking at a 5 watt 5 amp. Now, of course, if you know anything about electrical, you know that's 25 watts, not 27. And this is because the power supply is 27 watts. So you'd want a minimum of 27 watt to be able to push the maximum power consumption required of 25 watts. The problem we have is there is almost nothing on the market that follows these system specs. So finding a power output port that can charge that, difficult. Now, we have some quick charge ports, which I think the quick charge ports, I might be able to run it off of one of those. Running USB quick charge port up to a USB-C, I might be able to run those. I'd have to check exactly what the power output specs are. I think I can probably do that. But as far as how mine are wired in, I'm actually using specific 12 volt to 5 volts that specifically have a USB-C output, which allows me to control my device with a power switch on my wall. Because, of course, the old Raspberry Pis didn't have a power switch. Now, the new one actually does. There is some capability of a power switch put in here somewhere. I'm not sure if it's a separate standalone item or if it's a button on the device itself. I assume it's probably both, because in many applications you can't physically access the device, so you'd need some form of external device on the GPU pins. So that is the Pi he is talking about using. So now let's go ahead and get into his article itself. So what he's going to do, now the first big mistake he makes is he's like, okay, we're going to use this to replace my main computer. And then you didn't stop to think, what am I doing on that computer? Because that's the first thing. Okay, I'm not doing Zoom calls or doing a lot of video watching on my Pi. Now, can a Pi do that? Yes, but you have to specifically build them for that. That is why the Pi that sits next to that one is my media server Pi that plays movies flawlessly all day long. And that's a Raspberry Pi 2. Which has all of the codecs required, and it is just designed for that. Whereas a standard desktop type computer, there's too many things going on in the background to properly play something like video or Zoom calls or hook up multiple monitors and things like that. Although the Raspberry Pis do have multiple monitor outputs, I think probably they should rethink that or do something to make sure they work well, because that is certainly one of the struggles that he had. But the first thing is, what is your general use system for? We should be able to assume we should be able to play music and go on the internet and do some basic work, okay? But we're not doing a lot of heavy-duty video editing. In fact, we're probably not doing video editing at all on a Raspberry Pi. As far as image manipulation, sure, I do that for clients. I run GIMP a lot. I run Bluefish Editor. I run FileZilla. I run a variety of different web browsers. I don't think I have a music player on there, just because the way my setup is. I have a separate standalone media player and a 4-port audio switcher that allows me to use, worst case scenario, an MP3 player hooked into my main central sound that have a bunch of wall speakers plugged directly into the walls. Come on, man. I built this thing knowing what I was doing. So that's what he did. He bought an 8 gig Raspberry Pi 5. As soon as they went for pre-order, and then because he had bought all the other ones when they first came out, and then he was concerned about another Pi shortage. We did have a Pi shortage. I know it was tragedy. What can I do without my Pi? But in reality, there was a Pi shortage because of the chip shortages. That is now resolved. You can get your Raspberry Pis. You can get your 5s now. You can go back and get your 4s. I think you can even get 3s. Heck, I even bought a 2 not too long ago because I already had something built for a 2, and then I put this one media server into the wall, and I said, well, I still need something else for this other Pi 2. So I just ordered a separate Pi 2. So I have era of Pi 4, and I'm here ordering Pi 2s on the internet. Go figure. It was like $20 or something. It was pretty good. So he talks about some of the things he's using. That's awesome. So he's using a Homebridge, WireGuard, Dynamic DNS ISP Updater. That's pretty nice. He uses the Pi 3 as test hardware for small one-off projects or something that may or may not have been lost in a basement flood. Of course. It's like them pew-pews. Tragic boating accident. Tragic boating accident. But all that being said, that's great. I love the fact that this guy is willing to take his chance at playing with these. Now, what do I use Pis for around here? Obviously, I have the work one. I have the Media Center Pi. One of my Pis is my Open Media Vault, which controls all my central file systems. I also have another one in the wall, which is a PHP server. Although I'm going to take that out because I've not used that I've used it like twice in 3 years living on the road. So I have other plans for that, and I'll do a video on that when I get to it because it'll be fun. So that is really what I'm doing with mine. Of course, I do have some of these things that were potentially lost in there as well. You know, retro emulation boxes may or may not have been lost in a basement flood. A coyote dragged it off into the woods someday. It was that tragic. And then, of course, I do have one that floats around that gets used for random projects and things like that. They do specify in here, he talks briefly about the P400 variant, which is a Raspberry Pi built into a keyboard. Very limited use applications for that other than attempting to use a desktop computer because just the form factor. What are you doing with a giant keyboard? Hey, man, what are you doing with that giant keyboard? I'm like putting it next to here to steal stuff from your wallet. No. 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 But with that, he goes on and talks about what the various variants are and what they'll be using for. So, of course, he talks about his hardware is the P5. And the P5 is powerful enough now to have the onboard fans, but it still apparently ships without any kinds of coolers, which is kind of odd. At this point in time, they probably should start putting coolers on these things. They might last longer. But also it's possible they don't because a lot of the cases that you buy come with their own cooling solutions. So my NAS, for example, the whole case is a giant aluminum heatsink. The entire case is. And so what you do when you build that thing is you cramp it down and it clamps right down onto the processor and to the other chips that need cooling to allow heat dissipation directly into the case, which is its own heatsink. My Pi up here, it comes with heat sinks and a cooling fan. So the cases oftentimes solve the cooling issues, and that's probably why Raspberry Pi doesn't include them. Because if it did, and then you buy a case that also had cooling components, now you have random unusable cooling components laying around. It generates a lot of extra waste and a lot of extra garbage floating around. So I can understand why Pi doesn't, because most people who buy a Raspberry Pi, they're not just keeping a random board floating around. They actually have some purpose they're using that for, and in some purpose they're using that for, it probably deals with the cooling issue. So I'm okay with that. So he bought the official Pi case of the power supply from the local micro center, and I'm now jelly because I wished I had a store somewhere I could walk into and buy one from, but oh well. Best Buy used to have them, and then they were always sold out, and then the chip shortage, I think they stopped selling them. I don't know if they still do or not. I don't know. I'll have to look it up next time I go to a Best Buy in a big city. I'll see if they have Raspberry Pis. That would be epic. If I drive by Phoenix here and I stop by a Best Buy and they have a Raspberry Pi 5 in there, oh, you better bet I'm buying that thing. I'll figure out how to make it power later. Come on. All right. So he talks here about his setup and what he wanted to do. Now, he had initial settings and frustrations. Now, he says down here, his familiarity level is general comfort with Linux is somewhere between advanced beginner range, at least as long as he sticks to Debian-based distros. Now, this, in my opinion, is where he had the biggest downfall as far as having some struggles. Because if you're starting with a Raspberry Pi, first you have to understand you have a different chip architecture than most computers. So some packages are not available. GNU Cache, for example. I run GNU Cache for my businesses. It doesn't run on the Raspberry Pi. At least it didn't last time I tried to install it, but I run that on my work laptop instead. So some applications just aren't there. Also, the big problem with Debian is it is a little bit slower rolling out. Now, the latest versions are a lot better. And Raspberry Pi OS, which used to be called what was it called? Raspberry, I think is what it used to be called. It was a Debian coded specifically for the Raspberry Pi. That generally worked very well, but to his proper criticism in the article, it's not a super user-friendly desktop environment. It feels really old. It feels really stale. It feels like you want something else to do. And that really is part of his the problem. But the challenge I had is when I got mine is I wanted to play around and I wanted to stick somewhere in the Debian family. I didn't want to run Ubuntu. Now, he chose to do Ubuntu, but nothing in the Debian family I found really worked out of the box for everything. Now, that probably is solved. I built mine a long time ago. So in light of all of that, I played around. I installed a variety of different things on the cards. I put in... I tested the audio, I tested the video, I tested, the networking. I tested every component I could possibly test, and nothing I found in the Debian family, even including Ubuntu, really was what I wanted. But in my opinion, if this gentleman still has this and wants to play with us a little bit further, I went with Manjaro because it solved every problem at that time. So at that time, Manjaro was the best distribution. And I have been running Manjaro Plasma ever since. Now, I've had a few minor issues. It is, to me, feeling like I want to experiment with other things. Of course, MX Linux just dropped a Raspberry Pi version, so that might be really good as well to try. I want to play around with Armbian. To see how that works. Basically, I want to use my Pi and experiment with a few other distributions to see if something might be better than Manjaro now. Because what I don't like about it is I don't like putting Arch-based Linux on full production machines because, yeah, I've had many cases where I got to push an update because I got to push an update and something goes weird or wonky. Right now, very minor, but many GTK apps like Evolution just don't work right anymore. The mouse is a little bit lower than it needs to be in there, and I haven't quite figured out why, but there were some other mouse issues we had to resolve with changing the boot config file, and we did have an issue where a few people running Plasma, Manjaro Plasma, their system simply stopped responding altogether to the keyboard or the mouse. You had no choice but to hit the hard shutdown and then reboot it. And so there's a lot of different elements and factors there. Now, for the most part, though, running the Manjaro Pi for 3 years, very, very few problems. Very, very few problems. So that might be something you might play around with. Although if I were doing it again, I would definitely do the Manjaro XFCE instead of the Plasma. I went with a Plasma for a little bit more bling, but bling is costly on such a low-spec computer. So he hit his own walls, mostly with the first is his monitor. Now, the first actually problem he had is GNOME didn't run as well, and that was the problem I had with Ubuntu. Is GNOME is not going to... GNOME lags a little bit on virtual machine. GNOME lags a little bit on real hardware sometimes. I am not going to try GNOME on a Raspberry Pi. And that's unfortunately, Ubuntu has a big Raspberry Pi build. Maybe I should play around with it before criticizing it too much, but I just can't imagine it's going to be an absolutely amazing experience. All right. So he also had issues with anything requiring DRM. Particularly Wildvine in Firefox. I do not know if I have that problem. I know I've played a lot of different videos on Firefox on Manjaro Pi without a problem, although I'm not a person that uses anything like Netflix or Spotify, so I have no idea if those would work well on my system or not. I'm not sure. So he had those issues. He also had issues with his... this is just him talking about the limitations on the built-in, the Raspberry Pi OS. It lacks a lot of the modern things. We talked about that. He had issues with his monitors. Down here, it says, one of my monitors, M28U, could only run at 30 hertz regardless of what cable or HDMI he used. The Raspberry Pi, in theory, can run two 4K monitors at 60 hertz, but not in his setup. Using the M28U at 1044p allowed him to bump its refresh rate up to 144, but the Acer monitor would only set the resolution to 4K or 1080p, resulting in resolution mismatch either way. He ended up setting up 1080p for the second monitor just because. At the things frequency got choppy on the multi-monitor setup, and I imagine that'd be the case because you're utilizing extra power, you're utilizing extra system resources to run a dual monitor. This is one of those cases where I said earlier, it's like I don't think that running a Pi in a full dual monitor system with Zoom calls and Spotify going over here and also it's not what it's designed for. It's not going to be as good of a user experience. So if that's your idea of a general use computer, it's probably going to fall fairly short. In my case, I run my media on separate computers. I run a dual monitor on dual computer systems, not a dual monitor on a single computer system, which allows me to have separate resources going on the one system, much beefier system for media or for other backup things or for quick checks, checking email across other platforms, and then keep the other computer down for my basic work, my basic email, and basic things like that. And so he did try to sync his Google account to Chrome browser, which he said he had issues with that. I'm not sure why. He actually said that you used to be able to sign in to Google with Chrome's browser, but he couldn't. I'm not sure what's going on there because you should be able to sign into your Google account from the Chrome browser. I don't think that function's broken. I don't even think that function is necessarily broken on the Raspberry Pi either. That might be something related to Ubuntu, as the Chromium package is now a snap in Ubuntu, and that might be causing the conflict, is my random weird guess. I don't know without actually seeing the system. But I don't think that's a Raspberry Pi thing, but I don't know without seeing it. So he did say, let's see, it was clearly slower than Chromium at just about everything. It would regularly lock up the Pi, forcing a hard reboot. Oh, wait, tried to use Firefox for a while out of vague objection to Google and Chromium browsers. It was clearly slower than Chromium at just about everything. That's interesting because I use Firefox primarily on mine on a much older model and I have no problems with it. So that's interesting to me. Pi's browsers both come with uBlock Origin and AdBlocker installed when I tried to go without it for a while. Performance on most sites is worse than the AdBlocker disabled. That I ended up reinstalling and just keeping the Pi running terribly well. Interesting. Yeah, I cannot remember if I have AdBlocker on my Raspberry Pi Firefox. Of course, I do have a local networking blocking script that blocks all the ads on the network level. So I don't know what's the case. I also don't know what's the case that the ad blocker would reduce the performance of the browser. That's also odd to me and something I have not experienced. Again, maybe if you're running Ubuntu, maybe this is the Snap. Because Snap does not have as good a performance as a native app. And that might be the issue. So he says, these are just the issues I had with software. He burned a couple hours trying to install lightweight third-party Mastrial client for Dropbox, only to encounter constant errors with both the Python and the Docker-based version. I think this is probably just due to the difference in architecture. So this is the not being a Linux guy regularly. I think that this gentleman just doesn't understand there's different architectures for how the different softwares are compiled. And if he's trying to build or install an application for a different architecture, that certainly is going to cause the problem. I don't know. He does talk about there's no Zoom client or Skype client for the ARM system, which is probably true. So he's stuck with using the web browser on this, but then he used Box86 to allow x86 Linux apps on the ARM chip, and that solves some of his problems. But he did overall say he met in the middle. He made a few compromises he doesn't necessarily want to make, but end up making it and having a system that was reasonably usable. He was able to do Zoom calls. He was able to get things working. This is where he talked about the Chromium stuff. I must have skipped that paragraph earlier when I was reading ahead. I thought I read the whole thing all the way through, but he opened Chromium, imported bookmarks, signing into Chromium with Google account handle sync was once possible, but no longer appears to be. That's the thing. I'm not sure what he's talking about on that part. That could be the Snap version or something goofy on the Raspberry Pi, because that should not, like, that's deep in the Chromium base. You have to work hard to get that out of Chromium. Which Pi I don't think did. The Pi, he said, actually did fine. Not great, but fine. Listened to music, he researched, wrote a few articles, paid some bills, installed Audacity, which he said is nearly a year-old version. Of course, that's because Ubuntu's not updating a lot of the repo software because Snap, and it probably sounds like he wasn't running Snap. In fact, I'm not sure if Snap may or may not run on that. I don't know. I do not know. I have to think about that. SSH into the Pi 4 is configured to take place of the Pi 3 general purpose network box, bought a few things, took a couple Zoom calls, chatted with friends. So he did some SSH. Managed to use Pi as a general purpose multi-monitor computer and got by fine for a few days, although not the best of experience. He says here watching a ton of videos was not on the list. He says that this system does have two H.265 HVAC, I don't know what, Hep C codec, but it doesn't have the H.264. I think that's just dependent on the specific OS he chose or a configuration, as I'm pretty sure I have H.264 on my system, on Kodi, but I don't know. So, I mean, it depends on what you're doing. If you're using like LibreElec on a Pi, you're going to get perfectly fine video playback. But if you're doing a desktop operating system trying to do video playback, it is not a good experience. He says here that he could make it play, although it wasn't good on 1080p. I can confirm that. The highest resolution I can play video on mine is 720p. But for me, because of limitations on bandwidth and things like that, and the fact that I don't sit there and just watch stuff, and it's not critically important that I watch every fine detail of every little program, I actually set almost all of my streaming at 480p, 480 anyway, because it saves on bandwidth, it makes things run smoother, and I don't really care. That's me, though. So with that, he did mention, he said overclocking the Pi did improve the situation slightly. He followed Jeff Greerling's recommendations, managed to bump the Pi CPU from 2.4 to 3 and GPU from 800 to 900 after providing a bit more voltage. Settings do require a heat sink. Yeah, this is something you can change in the configuration of Raspberry Pi. You can go in and you can specify what the power rating is. In fact, my backup Pi that I use for basic development, for some reason, it will not output to most monitors anymore. It'll still output to my powered little small monitor, but I've not seen it be able to output. So I actually tried manually changing all of the power frequency ranges, and I've gotten zero luck with it. So I'm just going to swap that into one of the Pis in the case that never attaches a monitor and take one of those out and use that for my development when I get to doing this new project that I'm working on. So even with the overclocks doing everything else while playing non-accelerated videos, the fastest way to bring Pi to its knees, you'll still notice some jerkiness and hesitation when opening apps. And I completely concur. It is not a super ideal experience using a Raspberry Pi as a computer, but it does work depending on what type of jobs you're trying to do. And so these are some of those things that we need to keep in mind. When you're choosing a low-spec computer, you need to understand what you're trying to do it for. If you're getting it to do video editing or something, do not waste any money on a low-spec computer. If you're doing a Intel processor, I'd say i7 or higher. You could probably do some i5, but it's a bad experience. Ryzen 5 or higher is good. That works. All my computers are Ryzen 5. They work just fine for video editing. And but you're not going to be doing a lot of in-depth stuff on this. Nothing that requires a lot of rendering, nothing that requires a lot of hefty GPU usage or things like that. But overall, it is something that can functionally work if you want it to. So there are my thoughts about this fun article. Let me know your thoughts about this. Have you tried running a Raspberry Pi? And I will leave this article linked down there in the description so that you can get a chance to read through it yourself and see what you think. I thought it was a fascinating deal. I can't wait to pick up a Pi 5, even if I can't figure out how to make it run right out of the box, but we'll see. With that, guys, thanks for watching, and I hope that you enjoy switching to Linux. Thank you for watching this video from Switched to Linux. This channel would not be possible without the backing of the program supporters scrolling on the screen now. You can be a supporter at Patreon at patreon.com/TOMM or at thinklifemedia.com. I also want to thank the open source community who creates such excellent software that makes producing this show possible. Please remember to support your software communities. Thank you, and I hope that you enjoy switching to Linux.